I'm from the Trade and Agriculture Directorate and working on agriculture issues. And as my former speakers explained to you what the OECD is doing, I don't need to do it again. But my side of the OECD, we do economic analysis, and on the basis of this analysis, we develop recommendations for policymakers on first of all on agriculture policies, but more and more on the wider policy environment, which is very important for the agriculture sector. So in this presentation, I won't tell you about the future, except that the future is uncertain. But I'll try to highlight what are the global challenges very briefly, because it's already been done, looking at what are the productivity and sustainability trends at the moment, looking at market developments, the policy responses, and then briefly how the sector is responding, or it should be adapting to the future challenges, and some concluding remarks. So everybody knows there is a growth in the population growth. Also, the population is getting wealthier with some countries recording high growth, and that increases the demand for food, but also it changes it, like people would eat more meat, for example, in some developing countries, and more oil, vegetable oil. But also there's a growing demand for non-food products, of feed, of course, but mainly, but also biofuels and other chemicals and fibers. So what is needed is to improve the productivity growth, to do it sustainably, and do it along the food chain, not only primary agriculture, but looking at the whole food chain. And for that, you need to increase productivity growth of total factor productivity and partial factor productivity. Also improve the way the natural resources are used to make it more efficient, more sustainable. Agriculture will need to adapt to climate change and mitigate the impact of climate change. Reduce food waste, that's important. It's not only about increasing the total production, but also increasing what is available for the consumers. And then it means that practices will have to adapt, processes, and the products as well will have to be adapted to demand. And that will help tackle the global food security and the climate change challenges. So this graph was developed by Economic Research Service of USDA, Keith Foley, and what it shows that at the beginning of the 60s, agricultural growth was mainly due to an increase in the use of inputs per hectare. But now, in recent years, most of the improvement in total factor productivity is linked to agriculture growth is linked to total factor productivity, because so that's why it's really important to continue increasing this aspect, because that's graph from the same database, which is indicated in the source, shows the wide difference in total factor productivity growth across countries. Here we show OECD countries and also the BRICS, which are key partners for OECD. And the bar is the total factor productivity in the 90s, and the blue, the horizontal one, and the vertical one, it's the last decade. And what you see is that in many developed OECD countries, on the left, productivity growth has decreased, total factor, while in some other countries, including the transition economies and some emerging economies, productivity growth continues to increase. So globally, the picture is not as negative as some people thought a few years ago. But it's true that in developed countries, in European countries in particular, there is a specific problem, and that's why governments are really interested in improving innovation and make sure innovation can um, help sustain the productivity growth in the future. Voila. So that's a little bit. This slide shows what pressure agriculture is putting on natural resources. Um, so in OECD countries, agriculture is a very small share of GDP, but it's a much larger share of land or water or greenhouse gas emissions, not so much, 8%. But in some countries, for example, New Zealand, it can be much more. But what is striking is that it has a very large share of ammonia emissions. And in developing countries, the, 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 the use of agriculture, of natural resources, is even larger as a proportion of other activities, total activities. And in particular, it uses 70% of water, which is a problem in many countries. So what FAO and has found that is that there is a reduced rate of land expansion, and the potential for expanding land is limited to some region, and it's Latin America and Africa. But even in these regions where you can expand land, the land suffers from quality problems and also infrastructure problems. So that would require a lot of investment if you wanted to make it productive for agriculture. The reference is a report that was produced for the 2012 Mexican presidency of the G20. They found as well that there are big losses in biodiversity, mainly linked to land use changes. The OECD is doing, the Environment Directorate of OECD is doing a projection by 2050 about environmental projection outcome, and they found that 40% of the world population is likely to live near river basins with severe water stress. Agriculture is still a major source of water pollution from nutrient, but it also emits greenhouse gases, and that in the future, climate variability and extreme weather events are expected to increase. So that's the constraints on natural resources, the main ones. The picture in OECD is looking more better than it was in the 90s. That's the first top bar is the increased annual change in agriculture production volume, and the other bars are agri-environmental indicators. And what it shows is that the dark bar shows that between the end of the 90s and end of the 2000s, agriculture production has increased, but the pressure on the environment has decreased, and it was not the case the previous decade. But still, that's changed. So in reality, there are still major problems. So that shows the decoupling of agricultural growth from environmental pressure, because nitrogen and phosphate balance go down while agriculture GDP is slightly increasing. I mean, the last years were due to the decrease in prices, but now it's recovered. That's the same in terms of looking at the value of production in blue, and in red it's the emission of CO2 of greenhouse gas emissions in CO2 equivalent. So water withdrawals, the decrease on average, at least in OECD countries, but the problems of water quality remain. The biodiversity losses continue. On the other hand, the erosion risk, I think, are much more limited now to some regions, and the widespread loss of soil in OECD countries have been tackled. So that means that in governments, you've got a rising concern for the environmental impact of farming, and in society as well, of course, responding to societal demand. And also there's an expectation that agriculture will provide ecosystem services. So that's the kind of constraints that affect agriculture in OECD countries. In terms of policy responses to this sustainability challenge, the markets usually do not correct properly the price of do not evaluate properly the price of natural resources and environmental externalities, whether they're positive or negative. And the regulation are often ineffective or inappropriate, and the governance structures should be improved. So the challenge is to reform existing policies to remove distortions, remove especially environmental harmful subsidies, and implement instruments, market measures or taxes that put a correct price on natural resources to the extent possible, but also find ways to provide incentive for farmers to adopt more sustainability practices for farmers and the food chain and the food processing. So the OECD is doing a projection for the next 10 years for agriculture commodity markets. So I'll show you a little bit the last results. In terms of real agriculture prices, they're expected to continue to decline slightly because productivity growth is still increasing, but they won't be at the levels they were 15 years ago. They will decline, but from a higher level. In terms of relative prices between commodities, this year the prices of crops were relatively low and the prices of meat were high, and the prices of dairy were high at the beginning of the 2014, and then they decreased. But in general, what is expected is that the prices of crops of meat will be higher than the prices of cereals or feed, of crops, because the increase in demand is in the livestock sector, in the livestock products. What you see as well in the changes in the structure of markets is the emergence of the rising importance of emerging economies, in terms of demand in Asia and in terms of supply in in Brazil in particular. But also in Southeast Asia, they've become large increasing exporters of vegetable oil and rice. OECD projects that the demand for agriculture products will remain firm, although population growth is still increasing, but the growth is decreasing. And some emerging economies, the GDP is not increasing as much as it used to. But still, in the long term, it will continue to increase. And the growth in livestock production is expected to be larger than the growth in crop production in the next decade. But production and trade grow more slowly than in the previous decade. We think that agriculture markets will be less volatile than they were in recent years at the end of 2008, mainly because prices are higher, so the variability is lower, and also because the stocks recovered. But that could change very quickly, and the drivers of tension on the market, the low stock, the fact that biofuel demand was increasing a lot, and the growth in GDP, these drivers are much less now. So that's a graph that shows from the index of prices and So you see that in the 70s, the variability was much larger than it was at the end of the period. That's the kind of outlook we give. So it's variable, and then it's higher in the later year, but then it slightly goes down. There will be lots of changes in the regional pattern of production and trade. In Africa, there will be significant production expansion, or at least it's projected, but population growth is increasing a lot as well, so there's still demand. Asia is expected to account for half of the additional consumption and production in the world, and Latin America will provide meat and grain for the export markets. That there will be changes in diet, as I said, and the demand effect is that, in fact, the growth in food crop in consumption of grain for food is expected even to decline, because as people become richer, they eat less starch and more meat and more oil for their calories. But the feed crops will increase, because they will the livestock production will increase. In terms of protein, which includes fish in our model, the meat sector is really dominated by chicken, because by poultry, which has the highest growth, which is growing, and also dairy products will increase, although I think in recent projection it's less. And in terms of fat, the fast growth is in developing countries, and it's based on the fact that they change their eating habits. And sugar will grow in both developed and developing countries. This graph shows the different composition of the meat products. So it shows that poultry is increasing, pork is saturated. There'll be increase in beef in particular, but not so clear in beef. That shows as where the growth in production will come from, yield or area. And you see in Latin America, Caribbean countries, you've got an increase in the area harvested, but in the Pacific, Asia and Pacific region, it's really only the yield, with very little increase in our harvested area for some products. But of course, these projections, that dependent on the assumptions you put in the model, the macroeconomic assumptions about growth, the price of energy. Between the last year's outlook and this year's outlook, the price of oil has really decreased. But also the policies. For example, there's been relative changes in the biofuel policies, with the mandate having a lot of constraints on the changes in the mandates, although a lot of decisions have not been taken yet, so nobody quite knows what will happen. And trade agreements as well, which now you've got more bilateral trade agreements than action in Geneva. And long-term structural uncertainty, to the extent that this kind of model assumes that yield growth is constant, and that the structural change is there's no break in structural change patterns and consumption patterns. And also it doesn't take into account the fact that natural resource constraints could be more severe, and climate change. So to deal with these uncertainties, what we do is stochastic analysis, which shows how the variation in parameters can affect the outlook. At the same time, we do what we call long-term scenarios, which is a way to develop a long-term vision. That's not so much to tell you what the future will be in the long term. It's more to provide a base for discussion where people with different expertise, multidisciplinary, in a multidisciplinary way, think about what lays ahead. And that's the only way you can anticipate unknown future, because all this projection, it only assumes that what you see now will continue, and if you want to deal with real uncertainties, you need to think outside the box. And some aspects of this, so we developed 3 scenarios, different, and some aspects can be quantified by models, others can't, so it's really just a base for discussion, and that's a way to help government develop robust policies for the futures. And the difficulty for policymakers is to define policies that let the sector adjust and let the sector deals with uncertainties and guide long-term decisions, because you need long-term investment for the future competitiveness of agriculture, in particular in innovation, R&D, and education. And this need for foresight exercise, I think it's more increasingly recognized at international and national level, and you've seen like the UK foresight, the EU foresight, but also international organizations do it. And that's the contribution of the OECD at the bottom. So what the kind of advice we give to member state government is that they need to facilitate innovation. They need to put in place policies that facilitate innovation, structural change, and efficient use of natural resources, so that productivity growth can increase sustainably. But also you need to improve the resilience of the whole food chain or value chain. And for that, you need to have well-functioning market, input and output markets to guide the, industry decisions. In terms of agriculture policy, this really implies that you need to reduce distortions to production and trade, but you also need to remove impediments to structural adjustment and improve the targeting of measures to the outcome. But also we recommend them to look at broader than agriculture, to look at the general policy environment and in particular regulations. That this graph shows what has been the trend in support in OECD countries. But you see that support as a percentage of gross farm receipts has decreased significantly, but also there's been a change in the nature of this support, with much less support through markets or based on commodities, and increase in other type of payments, which are more and more decoupled, mean less that introduce less distortion to markets. But there are wide differences between countries. And what you see here is the extent to which there are constraints on practices, on the use of inputs in various countries. So in pale blue, it's the payments with it's a kind of cross compliance, like in the EU or in the US. So you get constraints to what you do in order to get the general payments, while in black it's really the agri-environmental payments, the voluntary measures, and in exchange for having more sustainable practices, you get a payment that should be linked to either your cost of compliance or the value of the externalities you provide. On the other hand, in emerging economies, we also measure support in emerging economies in key partners, the BRICS usually, but more than that. What you see is the levels of support have increased as the country developed. The rate of support reaches the OECD average, and it's particularly clear in China. That's the same finding as, I don't know if you know about Kim Anderson's project with the World Bank, but that's it links really GDP growth with levels of support. As you become rich, you support your agriculture. This is a new development as well, is the type of measures that has developed since the 2008 crisis. Is you have new, even before for biofuel, but you have new policy that subtract uh, uh, food products from the world supply through export restriction and through biofuel mandates or policies. And they include export tax, export quota, export bans, and that comes from the AMIS database. So AMIS is agriculture market information system that has been developed by as part of the G20 initiatives in 2011, and it monitors market development, short-term market development, and also policy indicators to so that government can coordinate if there is a new crisis, they can react. So it's a very neat tool, and now there's a database you can access directly. But the other trend is that you've got more measures that are targeted to the adoption of innovation in some countries, like loans for buying new technology, or but also for more sustainable practices and adaptation to climate change. But still, in many countries, broad-based income support still dominates. There should also be an effort to improve general services to the sector, and there we include research, education, training and advisory system, but also inspection systems, rural agriculture specific infrastructure and marketing. But in fact, when you look at the data, you don't see many increases in budget. So I guess it's also linked to the fact that there's a budget constraints. But we tell our country they should give more to these general services and less to broad-based income support to pay people who don't need it. So that's the kind of advice we give on agriculture policies, to focus on long-term competitiveness, which requires having efficient tools for risk management because of all the uncertainties that lie ahead. Also, the livestock disease might be more or might be more prominent or different. You will have different diseases that affect countries now with climate change and with globalization. Provide incentives for the adoption of innovation, and have outcome-based measures to promote environmentally friendly practices, adaptation to climate change, but also animal welfare, and respond to societal demand, and provide innovation and enhancing services. We also think that providing information to improve decision making is a much more efficient way to guide the sector than to act directly on markets. Because when you do long-term investment, you need to know what the opportunities will be. In terms of looking at the broader policy environment, we developed a framework that looks at all kinds of policies and see to which extent they affect investment, innovation, labor market adjustment, all that to improve innovation and for productivity growth and sustainability in the sector. And I think having clear regulation and having regulation that allow adoption of innovative technologies and practices is really important. Of course, access to credit is important also, because with the crisis, the banking crisis, there's been difficulties recently. In terms of capacity building, we put there in rural infrastructure, and in some countries it can be really a big a bottleneck. That has been the case in Brazil, where they couldn't bring the soybean to the harbor. But also in capacity building, we put labor policies and education policies, and there they should work together to make sure that the skills that are needed in the sector are matched in some ways. And that's a challenge in many countries, not always because industry and education don't speak to each other, but because of the time lag, and because things are changing so rapidly now that between the time you get into the education courses and you finish, I mean, it can be long. um, and then we look at how to improve the governance of to improve the efficiency of agriculture innovation system. So the sector has already adapted to all these signals from market and from policies, and they have adopted new technologies and practices. They are doing risk management. There's been significant farm consolidation, but at the same time, you've got now this dual structure where some farms remain small and pluriactive, and then others become really big. So for policymakers, it's a big challenge to know which clients who you deal with. There's been also changes in legal organizations. For example, in France, 30% of farms are organized as a society, although they are family farms, where the capital is owned by different people from the management, always family members but different. In a way, it's done to deal with this uncertainty in terms of financial uncertainty, so that the family remains separate from the business if you have any problem with the business. They are also changing the marketing strategies in some countries. But what the challenge, I think, is really to adapt to the changes in skills requirement, because agriculture has always required a lot of skills, but now it's getting even larger. Like you really need to be a businessman. You need to know about machinery, technology, computers, and the way they, of course, it's increasing the demand for education, but also for long life training and advice. And you see now that farmers are paying for advice because they find it so important. But also the other development is that some activities are contracted out. And you see the development of consultants and innovation brokers. And what we found in the country reviews that we've done is that having skills in management, in business management, really improve the innovation outcome and the productivity outcome. The industry is also responding, and they want to remain competitive. The competition is ever stronger. They invest in R&D, the big ones alone, but increasingly they're looking for partnerships with the public sector, and the public sector is also looking for partnership so that the research is being used and being commercialized. And the government are funding research now in a way that facilitates this public-private partnership. And the innovation are technological, but not only. It's also deals with the organization of the business and the marketing. There's also a lot of consolidation, and I won't talk about it. I'm not talking about retail in particular. One issue, in particular in Europe, with all these changes in policies, is to secure supplies in quantity, but more and more in quality, and then they do it through vertical coordination or contracting, but also by really looking at different sources of raw material. You also see that they try to segment the product and adapt to demand. They provide more information to consumers. They also try to green their operation. I think it's more of a way to, to, to gain some competitive edge. And that's a demand that comes from the retail sector, apparently, in many countries, and reduce food waste. It's a lot of food waste in the downstream industry. And also you have an internationalization, which is including foreign direct investment, because some regions are really growing and there are lots of opportunities in those regions. So in conclusion, I mean, the kind of message is that you need to deal with uncertainties because nobody will really know what happens. So risk management is really important. Having this foresight exercise is useful as well. And it's a way to have people talking together and sharing experience and information. That really long-term investment is needed for innovation. There's a need for strategic vision for innovation policy, and all stakeholders should be involved. Of course, research, education, but also in the industry, the government, and the farmers. And having evaluation at different levels, before, midterm, and post ex post, really helps improve the efficiency and adapt to new challenges, because you will need to do marginal adaptation, like in a research project. When it doesn't work, you need to evaluate and change your direction if needed, and that's really important to strengthen evaluation tools, information, and processes. And it, of course, you know that in education and research, but it has to be done in a more broader sense, not only little projects or with individual researchers. So anyway, thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to listen to your presentation and discussion, because I'm not here to present that, I'm here to learn.